Hey everyone, and welcome to the Deep Dive. Ready to explore something maybe a little unexpected?
Sounds intriguing.
Well, today we're going to be looking at the relationship between autism and avoidant personality disorder, AVPD for short.
Okay.
And we've got some excerpts here from a website called Cheap ABA.
Okay.
It's got tons of info on autism, and they actually suggest some pretty interesting links between the two.
Yeah. It is really interesting how
Yeah.
these two conditions can seem so different, like on the surface.
Right.
But when you really start digging into like the actual experiences of people, reading through these stories on Cheap ABA, you start to see these connections that are really
Yeah.
fascinating.
Yeah, and for those listening who might not be super familiar with AVPD,
Yeah.
can we start by just kind of painting a picture of it? Like, what are its defining features?
Sure. So
Mhm.
basically, AVPD is characterized by this like really pervasive feeling of inadequacy.
Okay.
So just imagine feeling constantly self-conscious and super sensitive to any kind of criticism. And it gets to the point where you actually start avoiding social situations as a way to cope.
Right.
And this can have a huge impact on your relationships, your work life, your overall well-being.
It makes sense. And what's so interesting about this deep dive is that,
Mhm.
AVPD can affect anyone, but our sources here are really pointing to a particularly strong connection
Yeah,
to people on the autism spectrum.
definitely.
And actually, Cheap ABA highlights a case study here about an individual named Alex.
Uh-huh.
And Alex, who is autistic, actually shared experiences that really line up with those core features of AVPD,
Yeah.
like intense anxiety in social situations, fear of judgment, a tendency to kind of withdraw from interactions.
That's a perfect example. It really highlights how the social challenges
Yeah.
that are inherent in both autism and AVPD
Right.
can kind of intersect and almost make each other even more challenging.
Absolutely.
So, we often talk about the difficulties that autistic individuals might face with social cues,
Yep.
communication styles, navigating all those unwritten rules of social engagement.
Absolutely.
Right.
Right.
And then on top of that,
Yeah.
you add the intense fear of rejection or criticism that kind of is the driving force behind avoidance in AVPD.
Right.
And yet, no wonder social situations can just feel so overwhelming
Totally overwhelming.
for someone dealing with both.
Yeah, for someone navigating both of those.
Exactly. But it's important to remember that even though they share some of these common struggles,
Right.
autism and AVPD are distinct conditions
Yes.
with their own unique characteristics.
Okay, so what are some of those key differences that we should be keeping in mind?
Okay, well, let's start with like the core deficits.
Okay.
In autism, it's primarily about differences in social communication,
Uh-huh.
often alongside some restricted interests and repetitive behaviors.
Yeah.
AVPD, on the other hand, it really centers around social inhibition, those feelings of inadequacy that we talked about,
Yeah.
and a heightened sensitivity to being negatively evaluated.
So it's not just about finding social situations difficult, it's the root of why
Exactly.
they're difficult.
Absolutely. And that difference in why,
Yeah.
also kind of shows up in how emotions are experienced and expressed.
Right.
So like take Alex, for example. He described feeling just incredibly overwhelmed in social situations, even to the point of having panic attacks.
Wow.
And that really aligns with the intense emotional responses, especially fear and anxiety,
Yeah.
that are really characteristic of AVPD.
It makes sense. And it's not that folks with autism don't experience those emotions.
Right.
It's more about how they're expressed and processed,
Yeah.
and particularly in those social contexts.
Exactly. And this actually brings us to another key difference, which is cognitive style.
Okay, interesting.
Autism can involve differences in cognitive processing,
Yeah.
like difficulty with abstract thinking or understanding another person's perspective. That's called theory of mind.
Yeah, so what about AVPD?
Yeah.
How does cognitive style play a role there?
Individuals with AVPD, they often develop this negative self-schema. So it's like this really deeply ingrained belief that they are inadequate or flawed.
Oh, wow.
And that can lead to constant self-doubt and just low self-esteem, which further fuels that cycle of avoidance.
Wow. So it's almost like two different internal scripts running
Yeah.
during social interactions, right? One focused on navigating the complexities that we see in autism,
Yeah.
and then the other just consumed by those feels of judgment and rejection, which are such a hallmark of AVPD.
That's a great way to put it.
Yeah.
Thinking back to Alex's experience,
Yeah.
he actually specifically mentioned struggling with this constant worry
Yeah.
that people were judging him negatively.
Wow.
And that just further reinforced his desire to avoid those social situations altogether.
That makes sense, and it really highlights how intertwined these two conditions can be
Absolutely.
and how important understanding the nuances is when it comes to, actually offering support and intervention.
Yeah, you're absolutely right.
Yeah.
And that actually brings us to another really important concept that comes up when we talk about autism,
Okay.
masking.
Right, masking.
And-
This is something that we hear about a lot within the autistic community.
Yeah.
This idea of suppressing those autistic traits to appear more neurotypical. And cheap ABA even suggests that masking might be more common in women on the spectrum, which could even lead to underdiagnosis.
Interesting.
But how does this tie into AVPD?
Well, yeah, think about the potential consequences of masking,
Hmm.
especially for someone who's already predisposed to social anxiety.
Right.
It can actually make those fears of judgment and rejection even worse
Wow.
because you're constantly worried about being found out,
Yeah.
like about people discovering the real you.
Right.
And for someone with AVPD, that real self is often seen as unacceptable or inadequate.
It's like living a double life,
Yeah.
which I can imagine being so exhausting.
Incredibly exhausting.
And according to cheap ABA, that constant pressure to mask can actually lead to even more avoidant behaviors.
Yeah. Exactly. It becomes this vicious cycle.
Right.
You avoid situations to avoid the anxiety of masking,
Yeah.
but then that just reinforces the avoidance.
It's a cycle.
Yeah.
And it's not just the internal pressure of masking, right?
Right.
We also have to think about the external world that everyone's having to navigate. Like
Right.
Alex described, navigating a world that often just isn't built for neurodiversity.
Yeah, it's tough.
Can be incredibly challenging.
Absolutely. And that brings us to sensory sensitivities.
Okay,
Right.
right. We know those are really common in autism.
Mm.
Things like loud noises, bright lights, certain textures.
Yeah,
It can all be just totally overwhelming.
completely.
And in fact, cheap ABA actually mentions a study
Okay.
that found a pretty significant overlap
Mm.
between sensory sensitivities and social anxiety
Interesting.
in autistic adults.
Yeah.
So how do those sensory sensitivities kind of play into this bigger picture of AVPD?
Well, imagine being constantly bombarded by sensory input. That's just overwhelming.
Yeah.
Lights, sounds, textures, even smells.
It's like your nervous system is in overdrive.
Exactly. And when you're in that state, it's really hard to engage with the world, let alone,
Yeah.
navigate those complex social interactions.
Right.
Think about like a really crowded, noisy party
Oh, yeah.
for someone with sensory sensitivities
Yeah.
that could feel unbearable.
Oh, absolutely.
And they might just avoid those kinds of situations altogether.
So it's not just about avoiding people, it's about avoiding that whole environment.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And that avoidance over time, it can become a way of life.
Right.
You start limiting your experiences, your interactions, even your exposure to anything that might trigger those sensitivities.
Which then leads to more isolation,
Exactly.
further reinforcing that whole cycle of avoidance.
Precisely. It's self-perpetuating.
Yeah.
And this is really where understanding, the interplay of all of these factors,
Right.
autism, AVPD, and sensory sensitivities becomes so important, because if we can really understand what's at the root of these challenges, then we can start to find ways to support those individuals who are struggling.
Absolutely. We've covered so much in this deep dive.
Yeah, we have.
But there's still a lot more to explore.
There is. We've only just scratched the surface.
Yeah, we've just scratched the surface.
We need to delve deeper into the real-life impact of masking, especially when you consider sensory sensitivities.
Yes.
And what all of this means in terms of actually providing support and accommodations.
We'll be back in just a moment to continue our deep dive into this complex relationship. Welcome back. We've been talking about this really interesting connection between autism and avoidant personality disorder.
Yeah.
And how masking can actually play a pretty big role in kind of amplifying social anxiety.
Definitely.
And cheap ABA even pointed out
Yeah.
that the pressure to mask can be especially intense in work environments,
Oh, yeah.
which often are really built around those neurotypical expectations.
Totally. And, for someone like Alex, who we were talking about earlier,
Right.
just the thought of having to navigate things like office small talk
Oh,
or all those like unspoken social rules of the workplace,
Yeah.
that could be enough to trigger a whole wave of anxiety and lead to even more avoidance.
And it's not even just about avoiding those specific interactions, right?
Right.
It's about the cumulative effect of constantly having to be on
Yeah.
and presenting a certain version of yourself that doesn't even feel authentic.
Exactly. And Cheap ABA had this really powerful quote from an autistic individual who described masking as
Oh,
wearing a costume every day.
wow.
And I think that really captures the emotional toll that this constant effort can take.
It makes me wonder if that experience might be different for someone with AVPD.
That's interesting.
You know, if their core fear is about being seen as inadequate,
Yeah,
maybe masking feels even more crucial to them.
I think so.
Even if it's not actually sustainable long term.
Yeah, it almost becomes like a survival mechanism, a way to kind of protect yourself from that fear of judgment and rejection.
Makes sense, but then, as we've been talking about, it can also lead to this disconnect from who you really are,
Right,
and
yeah.
even more inner conflict.
Absolutely. And we can't forget about the impact of sensory sensitivities, which we touched on earlier.
Right.
Cheap ABA included some research
Right?
suggesting that certain sensory experiences can be especially challenging for autistic individuals who also experience social anxiety.
Interesting.
For example, they found that fluorescent lighting,
Uh-huh.
which is in pretty much every workplace,
Yeah.
was a major trigger for sensory overload.
Which makes total sense.
Yeah, you imagine someone with AVPD already feeling on edge in a social situation,
Yeah.
and then you layer on top of that the buzzing of those fluorescent lights or that constant hum of office equipment.
It's a recipe for disaster.
It is.
It's guaranteed to increase anxiety and withdrawal.
Absolutely. And I think this brings us to a really important point that cheap ABA emphasizes.
Okay.
Sensory sensitivities aren't just about disliking certain sensations.
Yeah.
It's about how those sensations are actually processed and experienced,
Right.
which can be really different for someone on the autism spectrum.
Absolutely. And for individuals with both autism and AVPD,
Yeah.
those differences in sensory processing can hugely impact
Yeah.
their ability to cope with social situations.
Big time.
Yeah.
It's almost like their sensory world is just turned up way higher,
Right.
making even ordinary environments feel chaotic and overwhelming.
Yeah. It's like trying to have a conversation in a crowded room
Yeah,
when someone's blasting music in your ear.
exactly.
I just can't focus.
You can't
Really.
feel at ease.
And that's a great analogy
Yeah.
because it really underscores the importance of creating environments that are sensory friendly,
Yes,
especially for folks navigating both autism and AVPD.
for sure.
This could mean things like adjustable lighting,
Okay.
having quiet spaces for breaks,
Yeah.
even just being mindful of the sensory environment.
Correct. When you're planning social
Well,
gatherings.
those are great examples of accommodations that can really make a world of difference.
Yeah, and I think it highlights a key point.
What's that?
Really understanding the individual's specific needs and triggers is essential
Absolutely.
for offering support that actually works.
You're so right. There's no one-size-fits-all solution.
Nope.
What works for one person could be totally overwhelming for someone else.
Exactly. And that's where having professional guidance can be so valuable.
Right?
Therapists, counselors, other professionals who specialize in autism, AVPD, and sensory processing difficulties,
Yeah.
they can help individuals develop coping strategies,
Yeah.
understand their own triggers,
Right.
and really work towards creating a life that feels more fulfilling and manageable.
Absolutely. And don't underestimate the power of just feeling seen and understood.
Oh, that's huge.
Cheap ABA really highlighted the importance of validation,
Yeah.
especially for folks who have often felt misunderstood or judged for their differences. Just having someone acknowledge the challenges they face
Yeah,
can be so empowering.
it can.
And this brings us to another really important aspect of this whole conversation,
Okay.
which is the impact of all of this on a person's sense of self.
Right. If
Yeah.
you're constantly masking,
Yeah.
trying to fit in,
Right. Yeah.
navigating a world that doesn't always meet your needs,
Yeah.
it can really take a toll on your sense of identity.
So let's delve into that a little bit deeper.
Okay.
How does this really complex relationship
Yeah.
between autism, AVPD, and masking,
Mm-hmm.
how does it affect how someone sees themselves?
We should explore that in more detail right after we take a moment to hear from our sponsor.
And we're back to the deep dive. We've really been diving deep into this whole connection between autism and avoidant personality disorder
We have.
and the experience of masking.
Yeah, and as we were saying, this complex interplay can have a really huge impact on a person's sense of self.
Yeah, it's like
Like their very identity.
it's like trying to put together a puzzle
Uh-huh.
where some of the pieces are hidden, or even like you've been told those pieces don't belong.
Wow. Yeah.
How do you even start to see the full picture of yourself when you're navigating all these pressures?
It's such a good way to put it.
Yeah.
It really highlights, that struggle that so many people face when they're trying to figure out who they are while dealing with all these external and internal expectations.
And Cheap ABA actually had a really interesting point about this.
Okay.
They talked about how for some autistic individuals, masking can lead to feeling like an imposter.
Oh, wow.
Like they're always putting on a performance
Right.
instead of truly being themselves.
I think we can all relate to that to some degree.
Yeah.
We all wear different hats depending on the situation.
Right.
But when you're constantly masking, that feeling of not being genuine
Yeah.
can just take over your whole life.
And when you add to that, the core features of AVPD,
Yeah.
the fear of being inadequate, the hypersensitivity to any criticism, it just creates this whole other layer of complexity inside.
It does. Imagine carrying that feeling of not being good enough all the time,
Yeah.
while also feeling like you can't be your true self because you're afraid of what people will think.
Yeah.
It's no wonder people end up with low self-esteem and so much self-doubt.
And Cheap ABA actually
I
suggested
agree.
that this could even lead to a sort of identity crisis for some people,
That makes sense.
where they're really struggling to figure out who they are
Right.
with all these mixed messages coming at them.
And then you add in the stigma and misconceptions that surround both autism and AVPD.
Oh, yeah, we can't forget about that.
It just makes everything more difficult.
Right, because we're constantly told what normal is supposed to look like.
Yeah.
And anything outside of that can be met with judgment or just a lack of understanding.
That's so true.
So with all of these challenges, what can we do to better support individuals who are on this journey of self-discovery and acceptance?
Well, I think the first step is really creating a culture of understanding and acceptance.
Yeah.
And that starts with education,
Okay.
challenging those harmful stereotypes,
Right.
and really recognizing that neurodiversity is a strength.
It is.
It's not a weakness.
We need to change the story from fixing or curing to celebrating and embracing those different perspectives and talents.
That's exactly it. And, on an individual level, therapy can be so helpful
Yeah.
because it gives people a safe space to explore those complex emotions,
Yeah.
to process, the impact of all that masking,
Right.
and work towards building a stronger sense of self.
And really reclaim their authentic selves.
Yeah.
And recognize their own inherent worth.
Absolutely.
No matter what society might be telling them.
And let's not forget about the power of connection.
Right.
Support groups, online communities.
Yeah.
Those can be so valuable for people who are feeling isolated or just looking for a sense of belonging.
It's all about feeling seen and heard.
Right. It can make a world of difference.
So as we wrap up this deep dive into this really complex relationship between autism and avoidant personality disorder,
Yeah.
I think it's so important to leave our listeners with a feeling of hope.
I agree. While the challenges are real
They are.
and they can be tough,
Yeah.
there is support out there.
Absolutely. And with more awareness, more understanding, more acceptance, we can create a world where neurodiversity is celebrated.
Absolutely.
And everyone feels empowered to be their true selves.
That's the dream.
Thank you so much for joining us on this exploration.
Of course.
We hope you've learned something new about this really important topic.
Yeah.
And to all our listeners out there, keep learning, keep exploring, keep having those conversations that promote understanding and acceptance.
Yeah. Keep the conversation going.
Until next time, keep diving deep.